So I'm going to pass around a picture because I'm going to talk. I wasn't in the armed forces, so but being from a military family, having Ralph's father and Ralph being in the military, and my father's father in the military, I have a great respect for it. And so I'm going to tie into Pete's story a little bit and tell the only Vietnam story I have. I had, as it relates to wargaming, I had an uncle. We call him Goober in the family. That's his family nickname. But my uncle Paul was in Vietnam, and he was in the infantry. Ralph's met him. And he was, if you've seen Forrest Gump, and you see when he takes the pistol and he drives in the hole, he was that guy. He was the guy that got picked for all the shit jobs. He was point man on his platoon. He was the tunnel guy. And
what unit do you know?
I don't. He doesn't talk about it much, unlike you. And in fact, this story I'm getting third hand from my brother, the only person in the family that he ever really opened up to. He and my brother are a little closer than everybody else. They spent a lot of time in trucks traveling. And it affected him adversely mentally for his whole life. Still does. But as far as wargaming goes, and Pete's already talked about the canopy of the jungle, but and we're going to talk about, that's my grandfather, we're going to talk about him next. We talk a lot about, well, how far does this weapon shoot? And when we talk about Napoleonics and the Rev War and the black powder periods and horse and musket, we always talk about the undulation of the ground and whether or not you can see. But when we get to World War II and Vietnam and moderns, it's not the ground that's the enemy, it's the vegetation. And the story I have from him is he, being the point man on his platoon in the jungle in Vietnam, you can just leave it right there. He said that he came home alive for two reasons. He had only one weapon, like you did, and that was a Remington 12-gauge pump sawed off right at the gas tube, or the spring tube. And he had a dog. He said if it wasn't for the dog and the shotgun, he never would have made it home. And I've used a 12-gauge Remington shotgun for hunting, and he used buckshot, not slugs. And I know that even with the full barrel, you're talking 40 yards max. Cut off, probably 35 yards, maybe 30 yards. And he said that that's all he ever needed, because that's how close they were when he got in the shit at a point. So when you talk about how far does this weapon shoot, and pistols and submachine guns, we talk a lot about, well, those only shoot half as much. Well, maybe in the open that's important, when you're talking about fields and open areas and things like that. But if you're in the woods, everything shoots 2 inches. That's what I get from him. So that's just a quick story. The reason why I asked Ralph to talk is my grandfather, whose picture I passed around, he was in U.S. Army Amphib, and Earl's dad has a great respect for Marines. And one of the things that he always said, my Grandpa Reg, was, those damn Marines got all the credit, and we worked just as hard. So like you, he was in a branch of the service that probably didn't receive as much recognition for what they did as they probably could have. And I always respected for him for that. And I never got to meet Ralph's dad. He passed away before I was old enough to know him. But my Grandpa Reg just passed away recently, and I've known him my whole life. And he's always been my hero as far as military things go. And it was not until he got very close to the end of his years where he would open up at all. He never talked about his combat, and unlike Pete, he never got desensitized to that. He was in the VFW, and he always stayed pretty in touch with it. And I have a feeling he talked to his friends about it, his colleagues, but not civilians like myself. He'd always make an excuse like, well, there's ladies present, or maybe another time. But what he would talk about when pressed, because he knew I was interested in military history, is he would tell me some stories, and so that's what I'm going to tell today. Before I talk about that, he was in, I don't have his record, we're working on getting that, but, the government, it's hard to do. But he was in the Pacific Theater, he was Army Amphib there, and he actually received 4 Bronze Stars, and he told me he performed 5 landings. That tells me that most likely on 4 of those were not milk runs. And I don't know how many of those were unit citations and how many were personal citations, but I know you don't get a Bronze Star if you don't get shot at. So that's some scary stuff. So when he says that he worked as hard as the Marines, I believe it.
I don't think there is a unit Bronze Star, right? Is there, Pete?
No, Bronze Stars, there are 2 kinds. There's meritorious service
and valor.
And valor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know which his were, but I'll talk a little bit about one one commendation I do know he received. So he was at New Guinea, the southern Philippines, and Luzon. Those are 3 of the 5 places I know he was. So one of the things I didn't realize until very, very, very late in life is, and this ties into what Pete said, and I think this happened a lot more in the military than maybe civilians realize, but probably you military people do, is you know that in The Great Escape, James Garner plays the Scrouge. And that was my grandfather. And so much that both of the stories I'm going to tell have to do with his scrounging. The first one was the one commendation that he told me he received, and I don't believe this was one of the Bronze Stars, but he said he got a commendation, which means it went in his official record. When I get his official record, I'll have it, was that he at some point, and remember, he was a kid. I mean, he's the same age as Earl's dad, 19, 18, maybe 20. He scrounged the parts from a compressor, some type of refrigerant compressor, and he built an ice cream machine. Now, I hear ice cream machine in this age, I think, but I think what it was he designed a cooling coil around an old-fashioned ice cream machine for a hospital, for one of the field hospitals, so the soldiers could have real ice cream in the hospital. And he received a commendation for that. And all of the parts and the ingenuity to build it, he did himself. This is a kid from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who really didn't have any mechanical engineering training, but somehow he figured this out. And so he got a commendation from his officer, and he was just a buck private, so that was pretty neat. So that was one of the stories he told me. And so I always when I think of him, I think of James Gardner, where he's going around getting stuff and, making pickaxes from steel bed springs and stuff. And that was my grandfather, so I really like that. And there was an even better story, and this is the one that I really like. Gordon and I has been there. Who's been to the Framingham Museum and seen an actual Higgins boat? Or who's seen an actual Higgins boat, period? So if you haven't, they're 65 feet long, and they're 14 or 15 feet wide. It would barely fit in this room. And they're big. They have a big draft. So they're a big boat. I mean, they hold, what, a platoon? A little more than that. They're a big boat.
Craft project from Home Depot.
And they do. They're all plywood. So that was my grandfather's vehicle in Army Amphib. That's what they landed on. And they ran around in LSTs, and these things hung off the side of LSTs and other type of parent boats. But not only did they use the Higgins boat for landing, it was a utility vehicle. They just like moving the big amounts of cargo, that's what they moved back and forth to shore with. They went in and got the mail with it. They got their food and their water. They got rid of their refuse. Everything went in the Higgins boat, especially when you were out at sea. My grandfather, the Scrouge, during their tour, at some point acquired 2 18-horsepower diesel bilge pumps. I don't know where he stole them from. But what he said was he and his friends mounted on each side of the Higgins boat with the intakes going forward and the exhaust going back. And when they were running around, they would turn the bilge pumps on and have 36 extra horsepower. Well, a Higgins boat only has 400 or 500, so 36 is that's a 10% improvement. And he'd always get a grin, and he'd kind of get this kind of dastardly do-right grin. He'd say, "We had the fastest Higgins boat in the Pacific." So I always liked that because he didn't beam much when talking about his service. He was always proud of it. He was like Earl's dad. He always wore his hats. He was a volunteer at the VFW. And that picture with him and George Bush was him receiving a civil service award from President Bush for being a volunteer at the VA. He ran the reception desk after he couldn't drive Meals on Wheels and things like that to the veterans, and he greeted people, and he also acted as a counselor for modern vets. And he received the award from the president for that. So my military hero was my grandfather. And I'd just like to finish up. I was reading this book, Patton's Unsung Armor in the Ardennes, and a passage of it struck me as being appropriate for this venue. This is a book about the 10th Armor, who was assigned to Patton, but we always think about Patton rescuing Bastogne. But some people don't know that the 10th Armor ran in and actually beat the 101st to Bastogne to stop the bulge from penetrating. And then once the infantry dug in with the armor, everyone knows the story from there. So the author of this is Eugene Patterson, and he was a lieutenant in charge of an M3 Greyhound scout element. And I don't know if it was a squad or a platoon, but he was the head scout for the 10th Armor at the time of that. After the Bulge succeeded, Patton traded the 10th Armor, which Eugene and his compatriots hated, with another general for a unit that was a little closer to where he was going, and the 10th Armor went to Austria. And so this is a quote from Eugene Patterson about an event that happened in Austria. And I'm going to mispronounce the town name a little bit, and it's going to sound like Eindhoven. This did not happen in Belgium or Holland. It did happen in Austria. Creeping through the endless vineyards towards Endikoben, the next day I encountered a seemingly knowledgeable middle-aged German civilian who insisted there were no Deutsch Soldaten in the town ahead. Fine, I said, and invited him to sit on the front slope of my armored car as we slowly rolled into the town. Already a good move. No German soldiers fired on us, but a dozen surrendered as we rambled along the main street. One splendidly uniformed man attempted to escape, and I had him rounded up and put in the POW truck to be hauled back to the cage. He protested mightily, and the townsfolk roared with laughter, but I was unrelenting and sent him back as a prisoner of war, the town postman. This is a nice little quick read. If anyone's interested in it, it's not going to go in my permanent library because it's more a fun read than a history read, so you're welcome to borrow it.